All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel on alcohol and safety. My name is Laura Diaz, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. So we have some questions prepared for our panel members, and after each question, we'll open it up for audience questions related to that particular topic. This town hall is meant to provide general information and not specific legal representation. Before we get started, I would like to have the panelists introduce themselves. So panel, could you please provide your name, title, and organization, and a brief description of what you do? So we'll start with Todd first.
My name is Todd Coriel. I'm with the Blue Earth County Attorney's Office. My responsibilities there include prosecution of various alcohol-related offenses, various levels of those offenses for both the city and the county of Blue Earth. I've been an attorney for about 13 years. I've been a prosecutor for a majority of that. Our office has 14 or 15 prosecutors that handle a variety of criminal conduct as well as civil cases, child protection cases, and other things on behalf of the county of Blue Earth. So I look forward to your questions, and thanks for having me.
My name is Officer Wilkins, or Stephanie, you can refer to me as. I am a police officer with the Mankato Department of Public Safety. I have been for about 7 years now. I am also your campus resource officer, which that means whenever I check on duty, I'm up here patrolling your area and here as a resource for you guys.
I'm Thad Schunkweiler. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Science, and I'm a licensed mental health professional. And I've been here at the university now 4 years, and my background is primarily clinical in treating clients and patients with various mental health and substance use disorders, but my research is the intersection of how chemicals impact behavior and physiological functioning. And I'm super excited about being here at this panel. I'm often asked to talk about drugs, but most of the time I'm talking about marijuana and amphetamines and all these other drugs. But alcohol, as evidenced by the National Institutes of Health, is the #1 public health problem in our country. And so I'm honored to be able to come and talk about this particular issue.
Hello, my name is Linda Alvarez. I'm the Director for the Office of Equal Opportunity in Title IX here at MSU. Our office primarily is the investigative part of matters that involve our non-discrimination policy as well as our sexual violence policy. And that is for anything that involves students as well as our employees. And so our office would receive reports, and then we would reach out to those people who might be impacted and conduct the investigation and so on. And we also assist with making sure that regardless of whether a student or an employee wants to report to the university, they are aware of what the resources are on our campus to assist them.
My name is Laura Schultz. I'm the director of our Violence Awareness and Response program. The program itself has been in existence on our campus since 2006, and I've been in this role for the last 8 years. In this role, I really have 3 main responsibilities, and the first of those responsibilities is to be a confidential advocate for students who are victims and survivors of sexual violence and intimate partner violence or relationship abuse on this campus. So when I say confidential, I mean that students can come and talk with me whether or not they choose to report, whether or not they want to talk with anyone else. I can provide the resources. I can provide information about what that might look like, about the steps. I can also talk with students about maybe creating a safety plan if they're in an abusive relationship and they are planning to escape or even stay in that relationship. I can talk with them about some legal resources that are available to them if they are looking at orders for protection or harassment restraining orders. I work very closely with CADA around those issues and those topics. I also provide confidential advocacy through facilitating a support group on campus for students who are victims and survivors of sexual assault. So if there's anything that I'm talking about throughout the panel, throughout the day that you want to talk more about, know that I am a confidential resource on this campus. I can talk with you about any of those things in my office up in the Women's Center in CSU in this building on the 2nd floor, 218. The 2 other responsibilities that I have are programming. So we have a lot of programming throughout the year, especially during Domestic Violence Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and then also education. So going into classrooms and talking about these issues, talking about these topics, talking about common feelings that victims and survivors might experience, bystander intervention, some of these other pieces. But again, as I said, I work pretty closely with CADA often, and I will have Julia introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Julia Hamann. I'm a Blue Earth County community advocate for the Committee Against Domestic Abuse. That's a mouthful. We're often called CADA. I do primarily legal advocacy with victims, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So that could be in the criminal justice system if there's been a crime related to DV or SA that was reported. I can help walk through that process with a survivor. Also on the civil side, I can help write and file and also walk through the process of protection orders. Like Laura mentioned, we also do safety planning and just general kind of connection to resources, be those therapeutic resources or other community resources. The way I like to describe advocacy is really like we're that person on your team. So if you have a problem, if you have a question, maybe it's not directly related to our services, you can call us and we'll kind of help you figure out where you need to go from there. And I would also echo what Laura said, that our services are completely confidential as well. So it's a safe place to share whatever you might have to share.
Thank you, panelists. So we'll start off with our first question. So what are some of the potential health consequences of alcohol consumption? And we're going to start with that.
All right, so let's talk about the health consequences of alcohol consumption. So we have two types of consequences, health consequences, when it comes to alcohol. We have behavioral consequences and then physiological consequences, so the impact on behavior that alcohol has and the impact on physiological functioning. It's important to note that these consequences are dose dependent, meaning they're not just universal, that the more that you consume alcohol, the greater the consequence, if that makes sense. And so we also, within those two, behavioral and physiological, we have acute and then we have chronic. So long-term consequences and the consequences in the moment. So it's actually like a diagram of 4 different types of consequences. So let's first start with physiological consequences and the chronic physiological consequences of alcohol consumption. Most of us in the room are aware of the long-term health, consequences of drinking alcohol. We have things like heart disease, cirrhosis of the liver, various cancers, all sorts of physical health complications the longer that you're drinking. But most of you in the room probably aren't thinking about those consequences when you're consuming alcohol. Most young people aren't thinking, well, I might develop heart disease in my 50s or my 60s if I have this beer, right? We're not often thinking about those, but those are very real consequences that are dependent on how much you drink, how often you drink. Those things factor into those chronic physiological health consequences. And then let's talk about the acute health consequences. And you're, for the most part, from what I can see in the room, you're all in the demographic where this really hits home. At the 18 to 25-year-old range, the biggest concerns we have with alcohol are acute physiological consequences or toxicity. And sometimes we talk about that as overdose or alcohol poisoning, which is a bit misleading because alcohol, in fact, doesn't actually poison your body. It's not actually what happens physiologically. But when you think about alcohol overdose, what happens is that you are messing with the central nervous system. Alcohol is a depressant. It slows down neurological functioning in the brain. And when you're doing that, there are all sorts of consequences within the brain and throughout the body. And what happens with alcohol poisoning is this. There's a part of your brain called the medulla or mesencephalon, and that part of your brain is responsible for sending a signal to perform various physiological functions. One of them is respiration. None of you are consciously thinking about breathing right now. You might be now, but you weren't prior to this. You don't have to think about, I need to bring in oxygen to stay alive. That's because that region of your brain sends a signal to your lungs to expand and contract to bring in oxygen. Now, what happens when you start to introduce alcohol is it starts to interfere with all of those functions in our brain. And again, it's dose dependent. At mild doses, we start to inhibit things like anxieties. At moderate doses, we start to see things like impaired coordination. And at excessive doses, we start to see the medulla or myencephalon start to be impaired. Now, the good news is our body has an evolutionary safeguard to prevent us from alcohol overdose. And what happens when we start to consume too much alcohol? The first step is that we throw up, we vomit. And what happens then is there's a chemical trigger in the medulla that is sent that says there's a toxin in our system, we need to get it out of our stomach. And so you are inducing vomiting. And vomiting is the first step in alcohol toxicity. When you have a friend or you yourself are consuming alcohol and throwing up, that's stage 1 of alcohol overdose. Now there's this, there used to be this phenomenon known as a puke and rally, right? Where you throw up and then it's not time to stop, but rather it's time to keep going. And that's a pretty dangerous proposition because what your body is saying is you've had enough, stop drinking, get this toxin out. But when you keep drinking, there's another evolutionary safeguard. And that safeguard is essentially your brain passes you out. It makes you unconscious. And what it's doing is saying, hey, dummy, you are not stopping to drink, so we're gonna shut down the whole operation and have you pass out. And that is so you can't consume any more of that toxin. And that's really that last step or that final step of alcohol poisoning. When you have somebody who's unconscious or can't be awakened, they've been passed out because of the amount of the alcohol that's in their brain. And when someone dies from alcohol poisoning, it's most often because of a respiratory depression, meaning they suffocate to death. Because that signal in the brain that is sent to your lungs to bring in oxygen, it can't get there. There's a physiological process that happens in neurotransmission, but the basics of it is that your brain can't send that signal to your lungs. And so when you're passed out and unconscious, you essentially suffocate to death. And that is that's the most serious consequence of alcohol. And when you hear about alcohol overdose or alcohol poisoning, in those cases, it's somebody usually suffocating to death. So when you have a friend who is vomiting, it's time to stop drinking, right? Or if you yourself are vomiting, it's time to stop drinking. And if you have a friend who's unconscious and can't be woken up, that's a medical emergency. It is time to call 911 because the next step often, unfortunately, is people suffocate and die. And we've had instances of that on campus. I'm not here to tell you to drink or not to drink. You're all adults. You can make that decision for yourself, but I strongly advocate for responsible use of alcohol and learning that when enough is enough, because alcohol can be used to have a good time, but that good time can very quickly turn into not such a great time when you have friends or you yourself are being hospitalized or in some cases overdosing and resulting in a fatality. So we have those physiological health consequences that, again, range from those chronic long-term problems all the way to that acute physiological toxicity or overdose. The other side of it is something known as behavioral toxicity, and that's how you behave under the influence of alcohol. And much like alcohol disrupts the medulla, the part of your brain that controls those regulated vital functions, it also messes with the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex of your brain is where you make all of your decisions. And alcohol and decisions making, they don't mix very well, right? If you don't believe me, check your Snapchat story now, right? Go look at it and see how everyone's behaving right now. And then I would encourage you on Friday at 1 a.m. to go back and check that same Snapchat story. And oftentimes it's an entirely different story. And it's most likely due to people consuming alcohol. People do really stupid things when they're drinking. And that can result in things like fighting. People who are normally peaceful people would never think about fighting. You add alcohol to the mix, and now you have violence. And we have lots of cases in which people are drunk and getting into fights and having some serious health consequences because of those fights. We also have things like accidents, most notably car accidents. So when you are in a car drinking and driving and you veer off the road and hit a tree, it's not in fact the alcohol that's killing you, right? Your death certificate won't say that alcohol killed you, but rather it was your face hitting the windshield. That's what killed you. But we know that the alcohol alters your ability to behave and function, and that results in a car accident. With young people, particularly college students, one of the scariest things is falls. And we see this across our state, particularly this time of year where it's still nice enough to go sit out on your balconies and the patios. And we have young people who are drinking and they sit up on the edge of that patio and they lose their ability for coordination and balance and they fall backwards. We just had an MSU student last year who fell off a balcony and was hospitalized for an extended period of time and suffered severe brain injuries from that fall. We would call that behavioral toxicity, how you behave under the influence of alcohol. And once again, that is dose dependent. The more you drink, the more likely those behaviors result in some health consequence. And then we have the chronic health consequences of consuming alcohol. And those are things like relationship strains. You know, if you're having a friend who's going out to drink every once in a while, you can probably put up with that. But if you have a friend who is constantly drinking and constantly prioritizing drinking, you're likely not wanting to be their friend anymore, especially if you're not an avid drinker yourself. And so you have these relationships that get strained with friends, you have these relationships that get strained with your family, who have a whole host of negative health consequences that stem from that. And then before I wrap up, let's talk about addiction. How many of you are hoping to one day become an alcoholic? So I don't see any hands. And this is interesting because I've been treating people with alcohol use disorder for about 10 years, and I've never met someone in the hundreds of patients that I've treated who said, I started drinking to become an alcoholic. I've never met anyone who that was their answer. But there is a percentage of people who use alcohol who become dependent on that alcohol. And there's no way for me to tell you it'll be you, it'll be you, it'll be you, it won't be you, it will be you. We don't know. You're essentially playing Russian roulette. And again, alcohol, who becomes an alcoholic is really a myriad of factors that kind of play into it, but it again is dose dependent, the frequency it's being used, and other risk factors. But addiction is a very real health consequence that far too many people succumb to when they're consuming alcohol. I've had students tell me that it's no big deal, I'm in college, this is what college students do. And then I say, well, what happens when you graduate? There isn't some magical thing that happens and all of a sudden you stop acting like a college student. The behaviors that you're starting with now will carry on even after college is over and when all the parties are gone, but yet you're still living in those patterns. So lots of health consequences, most of which many of you don't even really think about as you're using alcohol. But I stress, again, responsible use of this drug because it's a very dangerous drug and it consumes lots of people in this country, and lots of college students get into serious health problems because of its use.
Thank you, Thad. Now we'll open it up for any questions from the audience regarding this topic. If you do have a question, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic over to you.
I know I have some students in here. You need to ask the questions. I can see you. You can't hide.
Okay, well, we'll go on to the next question, and then if you do think of anything, we can always come back. So the next question that we have is, what is the criteria to go to detox versus the ER? So what exactly happens? What's the process? Stephanie, can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so if law enforcement gets called to, let's say, a medical situation, for example, on campus, somebody is puking in their dorm room, when I'm responding as an officer, I'm thinking more of a medical type situation versus that person's going to detox, right? So when we get on scene, if this person is throwing up or if they're unconscious and we can't wake them up because maybe they did throw up and then passed out, that's more of a medical thing. We're gonna get ambulance there and they're gonna transport to the hospital. Now if we go to a call where it's somebody's, we found tripped and fell in the grass, they're inebriated, we're going there to do kind of a welfare check on them, see how they're doing, what's going on with them. That's more, we get on scene, we kind of talk to them, hey, how's it going, who are you, see how intoxicated they are. Can they answer our questions? Are they answering them correctly? Are they giving us their ID, not a credit card, when we say, can we have your ID? You know, those types of things to determine how intoxicated is this person. Can they care for themselves? Can we let this person just go home by themselves at night? That's another thing we have to do, is it's a liability on us. We can't just have you walk away, and if something were to happen to you, that would fall back on us, right? So if someone is intoxicated to the point where they can't care for themselves, they can't walk, maybe not throwing up, not passing out, so the medical side of thing, and they don't have a friend or a family member or anybody that's sober that can take care of them, then we start thinking about detox. And part of the question was, what does that process look like? I've never been to detox, So I actually had to call our New Ulm detox facility, which is where we transport people that need to go to detox. So I spoke to someone who kind of gave me the rundown of when you get into that facility all the way to when you get discharged from that facility. So I took some notes, so bear with me. Law enforcement is the #1 referral, which means law enforcement is the #1 agency that brings people to the New Ulm detox facility anyway. You get there and they're going to do a search of you. They want to remove anything that you may harm yourself with. I didn't realize that. That was new to me. So they're going to take like shoestrings from you. If you're wearing a sweatshirt with a hood with a string in it, they're going to remove that string if you want to keep it. Things like that. They lock up your wallet, purse, cell phone if you have those items with you. A lot of the times people don't. They're found just in the clothes that they're wearing, and that's how they go to detox. If your clothes are dirty, they will wash them for you and give you an outfit to wear in the meantime, kind of like scrub stuff. They said they have sweatpants and sweatshirts of various sizes for you guys to wear. In the first 24 hours you are there, every 4 hours they're checking your vitals. And they're doing what they called a withdrawal assessment. So they're taking blood pressure, heartbeats, they're having you blow into a breathalyzer, what we call as a PBT, and taking down what your blood alcohol concentration is every 4 hours in the first 24 hours you're there. The second day, they're still monitoring you, because it's a health care facility. They're still monitoring you, but only doing your vitals now once a shift. And there's 3 shifts, so you're doing about 3 times a day now. Still checking you for withdrawal symptoms, still having you blow into that breathalyzer, gauging how you're doing and reacting. In the meantime, you're getting lunch, you're getting dinner, you're getting snacks, juice, milk. You're able to watch TV, watch movies, play games, that kind of thing. It is a 16-room facility, 2 beds in each room. There's only 2 rooms that have a single bed. So if you want a single bed, it's first come, first serve. So you would have a roommate in this case. On the 3rd day is when they check your vitals again. You will fill out an alcohol drug assessment questionnaire, and if everything is good, they then discharge you. And you have to have a ride lined up, transportation, before they release you. They don't just open the door and say, see ya. You have to have, whether it's a taxi, Uber, Lyft, a friend, roommate, family member, come to their facility, and they make sure that you leave their building and go into that car, whatever it is. Worst case scenario, if you can't afford transportation, if no one's willing to come get you, they will give you a ride back home, wherever that is. That is a cost, though, not free of charge. The lady I spoke to said on average, they have people there, it's at least 48 hours. On average, it's about 2.5 days. It's up to 72 hours, so 3 days. You can be released before 48 hours, but you have to get an attorney, to get a judge, to get a court order to release you before the 48 hours are up. Again, another expense. They provide you with toiletries. Of course, you got to brush your teeth, and toilet paper and shampoo, conditioner to shower, that kind of stuff. If you are on a daily medication, if your prescription is current and you can get that, they will provide you with that medication as well. Anybody want to guess how much it is per day?
Go ahead.
Sorry? That's high, but it's $439 a day. I don't have that kind of money, so I don't want to pay that, but that is before billing insurance, and there's some discounts depending on your insurance provider, that kind of thing, but $439 per day to be in detox and to have all of those services provided to you. That's it. Do you guys have questions with that?
Yeah. We've got a question in the back.
Yeah. Hastings, Rochester.
How does Minnesota's medical amnesty law work?
Ooh, that's a great segue into.
These two wanted to add.
Oh.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yep. Hold on 1 second. We're just going to add one more thing.
To the detox thing, you know, New Ulm only has so many beds, and on weekends like this upcoming weekend, where there's going to be lots of going on with homecoming, there's a chance that it's full. Well, that doesn't mean you get to skip going to detox. It means you go to another detox. And that may mean Hastings, Minnesota, Fargo, North Dakota. And as Officer Wilkins said, you're responsible for finding your own way home. So imagine having to call your parents or a roommate and say, hey, I'm in Fargo. Can you come and get me? Because it most often is a one-way ticket to detox. And the way Officer Wilkins kind of described it, it seemed like a nice place to go. There's cable TV, there's snacks, but rest assured, it is not a vacation. It's not somewhere you want to be. It's somewhere you may need to be because of your blood alcohol concentration, because of those health consequences. So when you're taking the detox, it's a very serious issue. Maybe not as far as criminal. I'll let the criminal folks answer that. But from a health place, that's a medical emergency. If you're in detox, it's basically being admitted to a healthcare facility. That's a medical emergency.
Todd, can you add to that and then answer
Sure.
the question?
The other place you might go after you get down with detox and the ride you might get is back to the jail. Oftentimes, if you end up in detox because of a criminal consequence, our office will receive a referral from law enforcement to request us to review criminal charges. And if we make a decision that the reason you ended up in detox was serious enough, we'll do a complaint warrant that we'll try to get signed by the judge. So when you get released from detox, there's typically a sheriff's department officer, law enforcement officer sitting out front ready to give you a ride back to the jail. Then you're going to sit in the jail until we can get you in front of the judge, and then the judge is going to set conditions of release on you that might include no use or possession of alcohol. It might include electronic alcohol monitoring. It might include monetary bail that you have to post in order to even be released from jail. So I just wanted to point out that the ride you might get might not be a friendly ride as well.
And what about the state policy on medical amnesty?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. Thank you. That actually leads right into the next question, which is essentially a discussion about the difference between your campus medical amnesty policy and what's referred to as medical amnesty, or under the statute, is really an immunity from certain prosecutions. And there's two real places you find that in Minnesota law. One involves controlled substances, which I'm not going to get into. There's some various small differences between that and the one involving alcohol. The other medical amnesty spot you're going to see it is with alcohol-related offenses that are underage consumption, underage possession of alcohol. And what that policy, or what the statute basically says, is if you're the first person to call 911 in response to a medical situation of an immediate medical or health concern of either yourself or a friend of yours or somebody that you witnessed, and you wait around for law enforcement to come and you cooperate with law enforcement to come, that you shall not be prosecuted for that offense. Now, that typically applies only to one individual. It can apply to individuals acting in concert to call law enforcement to seek that medical help for that individual. It has to be an immediate medical or health concern in order for the statute to apply. And the statute's fairly rigid. You also have to give your personal contact information, and again, you have to be there when law enforcement arrives. If somebody else called law enforcement before you, technically the statute wouldn't apply because you have to be the first one to do it. Now, what I'll say is that the statute does have some strict guidelines to it. Now, as prosecutors, our job isn't solely to seek convictions for criminal activity. We exercise discretion to attempt to obtain what we'd consider as a just result on certain cases. And there have been situations where I've taken a look at a potential underage consumption charge or an underage possession charge that involve facts similar to what's in the immunity statute and elected not to prosecute it because it just didn't seem like the right thing to do, that the individual that called was doing what they were supposed to be doing. We're not out to hang people. We're not out to throw people in jail. We encourage people to contact law enforcement for those situations for rather obvious reasons. So with that, I guess I'd pass it down to whoever wants to talk about the campus policy.
Sure, and I can chime in on there. So the medical amnesty for our campus is under the alcohol and other drug policies. There's also some wording in our 1B3 response to sexual violence, which Laura will speak a little bit more to. But it's very similar to the state in that the first person who calls for help, whether that be calling 911 or another campus official, so let's say you call security, that would be an example of that, when the person who is in need of the medical services is immune from sanctions and disciplinary action. So typically what that means is that you would still be required to meet with someone in the student conduct office or residential life, depending on where the incident occurred. And you will have to complete an alcohol education course, but you won't be billed for it, so you won't receive the charge. And then there's an expectation that for the next 12 months, you do not receive are engaging in any other alcohol-related violations. If you do, then you get charged for the initial, and then you have to face further consequences for any other incident. So generally speaking, the policy exists because we want to encourage students to report and call someone for help when help is needed, and not worry so much about, I'm going to get in trouble because I was drinking. The first thought should be more about helping yourself or helping your friend who may be in trouble, and not getting to that point where there's a more dire consequences, as have already been talked about.
Right. So from my role on campus, as I talked about, one of the primary things that I'm talking with students about is if they've been sexually assaulted, they may feel afraid to report because they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble for that. And that's kind of where the medical amnesty intersects with my role. That a student who is sexually assaulted, who has been drinking or is under the influence of drugs, should not be getting in trouble on our campus as a result of that medical amnesty. It's also important to note that alcohol is the most commonly used drug to commit drug-facilitated sexual assault against individuals. So this is commonly used by perpetrators to commit acts of sexual assault and sexual violence. So I just really want to kind of zoom in on the fact that this is absolutely not your fault. If you have experienced sexual assault while you were drinking or while someone drugged your drink, that is not your fault. And you always have people who you can talk to on our campus about that, and you should not be getting in trouble for that.
Any other panelists want to chime in?
Well, I'll chime back in.
Okay.
On one note, which I think is a question later on, but related to what we've been speaking about, which is in our investigative process, where our office is involved in investigation involving sexual violence, so which includes sexual assaults, both the person who might be considered our complainant as well as witnesses, we're not looking at sanctioning those individuals. People who are voluntarily participating to provide us information about what may have occurred, what they saw, and so on. We're not going to be looking at that for a referral to student conduct or looking at any sort of sanctions. Our interest there is on the matter that might involve sexual violence. So it's not necessarily medical amnesty, but that is something that we consider in our process.
Excellent, thank you. Out to the audience, any questions regarding medical amnesty and or detox? Oh, we've got one question over there.
Statistically, have we seen any of the death toll lower, or that this Minnesota amnesty has helped at all?
Anybody can chime in for that one.
I'm going to give Thad the microphone because he's better at this than I am.
Sam, that's a great question, right? She's one of my students. The answer is, I don't know. I don't know if this type of data is collected, so I can't speak to specifics if this has helped people, but anecdotally, I would say absolutely. And I think I'm glad that this question was asked because having been in your shoes, not old enough to drink or just starting to experiment with alcohol, there's lots of fear, lots of I don't want to get in trouble, I don't want to disappoint people, and that can kind of take over or hijack decision making. And while you can live with getting a minor consumption and you can live with getting a ticket, I'm not here to encourage it, but you can live with those things, it will be very difficult to live with knowing you could have helped somebody and you didn't because of that fear. And that has happened lots of times in lots of places where people were consumed by that fear and didn't act and didn't help a friend when they know they should because they were preserving their own self-interest. I don't want to get in trouble. I can't get another minor. I can't, have this. I'll lose my scholarship. I'll get kicked off a sports team. That sucks, and that'll happen. But I can guarantee you would rather have that than go to bed at night for the rest of your life knowing somebody died because you didn't do something. And when we're talking about alcohol, we often think of it very playfully, like it's not that big of a deal, because we see it everywhere. It's on our television nonstop. It's in the movies you watch. There are liquor stores literally within just walking distance all over campus. We are inundated by alcohol. So we get this psychological lull, like it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. And it's not until it is. And when it is, it can be a very big deal, both from a health consequence standpoint, sexual violence, physical violence. That is all correlated and tied in with alcohol. So it was a long answer to your question, Sam. And I'll look. I can't imagine, again, I think with health privacy concerns, I just don't know that anyone or anywhere is collecting that information. What we do collect from healthcare is reasons people visit the emergency room, and we can attribute kind of what brought them in. And by far and away, the number one reason people visit the emergency room as far as drugs are concerned is alcohol. It's not methamphetamine, it's not opioids, it's not marijuana, it's not ecstasy, it's not all these drugs that we sensationalize and think are super hardcore, and we know that those drugs are dangerous. It isn't even close. The number one reason people are admitted to the ER when it comes to drugs is alcohol. And it's because of the physiological symptoms and consequences of consuming alcohol, but also those behavioral things, people doing stupid things when they're under the influence of alcohol. So, good question. I think I'll try to find it, but I would say we're probably not collecting that information. But that's a great question.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to our next question here. So, Julia, if I was sexually assaulted while drinking underage, will I get in trouble for seeking medical attention? Like if I go to the ER, will they tell police?
In my experience, no, that it's kind of related to the last question. The biggest concern is the most serious crime that was committed in that situation. So if law enforcement are even ever to be involved after you go to the ER, their biggest concern is the sexual assault rather than the minor consumption. That being said, if you go to the ER to get a sexual assault exam, it might not ever necessarily be reported to law enforcement unless the victim were to choose to report it. They actually have to give signed consent for that information to be turned over to law enforcement. Otherwise, anything shared during that exam would be protected under medical privacy laws. The only people that do get that information, the details of the assault, would be the sexual assault nurse examiner, an advocate, if you request for an advocate to be there. They would be the only people getting the details, unless, of course, you then decided to report to law enforcement. Other people involved might be a physician just to check you over medically, but they would only know the medical concerns, and then possibly a social worker, but also they would just know the general that you were assaulted. They wouldn't know any other details. And that information also could not be released by them or, the advocate involved either. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah. Panelists? Anybody else wouldn't want to add? I think Todd.
Sure, thanks. And I'll just add on that I've never in my career seen somebody charged with an underage consumption for reporting a sexual assault case or going to the hospital to report a possible sexual assault case. Medical amnesty wouldn't technically apply to after, and unless the emergency is still there and immediate, doesn't apply. But again, anecdotally, nobody in our office looks to charge that out because we're more concerned about what happened to you, not whether or not you were drinking alcohol. So practically speaking, it just doesn't get charged out because that's not our concern. We're looking for encouraging reporting and encouraging that type of behavior, not punishing it. So.
And then I was just going to add that that if an individual was seeking a sexual assault exam, that they could call CADA directly, and that an advocate could go with you. 24/7, that you wouldn't have to be alone, that, as Julia said, they're completely confidential, that process typically takes, is it about 2 hours still? 2 to 4 hours. So I know that I've worked with students who have said it's really great to have someone there, to have an advocate there, to be with them, but of course that's always your choice too. And we do have a SANE trained nurse on our campus as well. So that's something to keep in mind if that's something that you ever wanted to utilize on our campus. And if you weren't sure exactly how to go about any of these processes and you're on campus, again, I'd welcome you to talk with me and I could help you through any of those steps.
Okay. We're going to jump into the next question as they're a little bit connected here. So who do I call if I think I was sexually assaulted, but I'm not sure because I blacked out? And do I get in trouble for that too? So Linda, could you answer that for us?
Sure. Again, some of the options for who to call on our campus, you can certainly call security directly, and then they will likely go through with your options about contacting the local police. You can also call police directly as well. Whether or not you know what may have happened and the full details or something, those things don't matter. If you're concerned that something may have happened, there are people that you can talk to. And again, if you're not sure about whether this happened and whether you want to involve other people, again, CADA and Laura's office, those are individuals that you can talk to if you're not certain what your options are and what you should do. But don't hesitate just because you're not sure exactly what happened. And again, it relates back to whether you get in trouble or not of blacking out. We've already mentioned as far as in our processes that we wouldn't be going to try to sanction you in some way or to charge you because you've experienced something and you may have consumed alcohol. So again, just wanting to encourage people to come forward and seek the resources that are available.
Anybody else want to add to that? Oh, we've got a couple.
So I would also add that you can certainly call CADA. We do have a 24/7 crisis line, so there's always a trained advocate available for you to speak to. Like Laura mentioned, we can talk to you about what your options are and then walk through that process with you, actually. So if you decide to go to law enforcement, we can go there with you. If you decide to go to the Title IX office, we can go there with you. We can be there for you in any capacity that you need. I would also add, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the sexual assaults that we work with are unclear. There's lack of memory that could be due to, like Laura mentioned, because it was alcohol facilitated or drug facilitated. And it's also just a natural consequence of trauma. Sometimes our brain's natural response to protect ourselves from a traumatic experience is to block it out of our memory. So if that is something that you or anyone you know has experienced, it doesn't mean the assault didn't happen. It's nothing to be feel shame for or feel guilt about. It's common, it's natural, and an advocate will believe you, will still listen to you, we're gonna support you no matter what the circumstances of the assault may have been.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I was going to add is that this is always your lived experience to share however you see fit with whomever you see fit. You get to decide to whom and how you share what you experienced. I might just, I think so. So I also wanted to note that many individuals who we might work with may not be reporting immediately after an assault. That's absolutely okay too. This might be a while. This might be 6 months. This might be a year after. There's some research that I have seen that says on average about 6 months afterwards, individuals tend to come forward. That's on average. And that is completely okay. We're always going to be here for you. We're never going to say it's been too long. We're not going to talk about this anymore. There are no qualifiers to speak with us as advocates about the experience that you've had. A lot of times for folks, it is through sort of a trigger that occurs. So maybe they're sitting in a classroom and there's a presentation about sexual assault, and they thought, I didn't want to think about this. I was trying not to think about this. I was actively trying not to remember this. Trauma affected my memory in a very specific way, so I couldn't really remember all of this. And now in this moment, a lot of it came back, and I need to speak with someone. So I just want to normalize that as well, that this might not be the day after the night of that you feel ready or that you feel comfortable or that you remember enough that you want to talk with someone about it. I also want to stress the fact that if the first person who you spoke to about something like this was not supportive, know that there are other people on this campus and in this community who absolutely are supportive, who can support you through your own process of healing, whatever that looks like for you.
Just off of what Laura was just saying too, maybe if you're not the victim or survivor, but you're the first person that somebody is sharing with, keep these things in mind. You know, make sure that you're telling them that you believe them and telling them that they're brave for sharing their story, and also, you know, being mindful of what the resources are, but not pushing them to make any decision that's not their own. Not telling them, oh, sometimes people say you have to call the police, you have to report, you better go to the ER, and people aren't ready to do that. So you can, you know, certainly share what their resources are since you've learned them, but don't push.
Just a small little plug. Speaking of resources, we're talking about a lot of different things here and services available. I know there's a table out there where a lot of information is available. One of those items is a little magnet that has the names and contact phone numbers for CADA, for the Violence Awareness Response Program, for our office, for security. And then there's pamphlets for a lot of the services. So if you don't have one already, grab one on the way out. Hopefully, you won't need to use them, but know that they are there in case you or someone that you know might need to.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to flip it over to the audience. Does anybody have any questions related to these topics? Thank you. Megan's coming around with Mike.
So this is more towards the like sexual assault. So if I tell a friend and then they decide to report it to the police, what happens then? Are the police going to call me and start questioning about it, or will they wait until I, as a survivor, call and want to report it at that point?
If it was reported to me, I would strongly encourage the reporter to have the victim survivor call us when they're ready. I'm not going to reach out to that person until they're ready. That's me. I can't speak for all the officers, but I'm not going to call someone out of the blue and be like, hey, your friend Rachel called and reported this, let's talk. I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to strongly encourage that complainant, that reporter, to speak with that person, and whether it's to call me or security or CADA and offer up resources. But I'm not gonna do that. No, that'll be way out of the blue.
In regards to underage consumption, how much is a ticket typically in Blue Earth County? And if I get multiple, does the price keep going up, or at some point do you just say enough tickets and you go to jail?
Sure, thank you. So an underage consumption crime in Minnesota is a misdemeanor punishable by a maximum penalty up to 90 days in jail or a $1,000 fine. However, they're treated as payable offenses if it's the only charge you have as an underage consumption. So the process with that is you're either going to get a ticket from law enforcement on the spot, or we're going to get a request to review charges, and we may file charges against you for that underage consumption. You're going to then either have the option, and the ticket will tell you what your options are right on there, so read the whole ticket. You can either pay it online, or you can request a hearing or show up at our arraignment court process and talk to us about it. The baseline fine is $100. There's court costs and surcharges that total $79, so you're usually looking at about a $179 ticket for just an underage consumption. Some underage consumptions come along with, obviously, with other penalties or crimes that are charged. You have social host ordinances. Sometimes there's driving conduct involved. Sometimes there's fights that are involved. And that all will play into what the consequence is financially. If you get multiple underage consumptions, even though it's technically payable, we have the option of removing it from the payable list if we want. And we're going to start looking at jail time. We're going to start looking at probation and programming to make sure that there isn't a significant alcohol problem. That might include a chemical use assessment that will be done by a professional to determine what kind of chemical use problems you have. If it's a bad enough problem, that might include inpatient treatment, for instance, or intensive inpatient or outpatient treatment. It might include just going to Alcoholics Anonymous. It might just include not using. But we do have the option to remove it from the payable list if we think, if you rack up too many of them, I'm absolutely going to ask you to go to jail. If you're driving and your alcohol level is bad enough if you're underage, I'm absolutely going to ask you to go to jail. And you always have the right to talk to the prosecutor or your own attorney about what the other consequences might be.
Excellent, thank you. And we've got another question right over here.
What happens if I have a party and it gets busted up by the cops and there's people under 21 there? Hypothetically.
So this happens all the time. We go and respond to a loud party complaint. We have to verify that there is a party going on, whether that's pulling up 2 blocks from your house and hearing the bass pumping and the people yelling and screaming and people are in and out of the backyard, front yard, that kind of thing. Typically, it is a 2-car call, meaning there's 2 of us that'll show up, verify there's a party going on. We will knock on the door and try to make contact with whoever lives at that apartment or that house. Typically, it's a guest that will answer it, and we will say, "Hi, we're the police. Go get so-and-so or whoever lives here." I strongly encourage people to open the door, first of all, not to just turn the lights off and shh, everyone quiet, the cops are here. That doesn't end well because we won't go away. We can't be like, "Oh, nobody's home," and just leave, So we've had search warrants written up to go into that residence without your consent because there's probable cause enough to realize that there's people in there drinking underage and there's a loud party going on. So the best option for you as a tenant is to open the door and speak with us in the first place. Level of cooperation plays a role in these calls. If you guys are going to be disrespectful and rude, it's not going to get you very far with us. If you're going to be cooperative and nice, that'll go a long way. If we decide to process that house, that loud party, what that means is we are going to identify every single one of the people in that house. If they've been drinking, we're going to have you blow into a breathalyzer and get your blood alcohol concentration. If you are under 21 and you blow whatever, a 0.0 whatever, showing you have been consuming alcohol, you are going to get a underage consumption ticket. If you are 21 or older and you're at that house, we just need to identify you, make sure you don't have any warrants, and then you're free to go. If you're under 21 and you get that ticket, we're going to make sure that you are able to walk out of that house and go. We're not going to let you just go stumbling down the sidewalk. That, again, is a potential for either a hospital or detox visit. As the tenants of that house or that apartment, once everybody has been identified and left, they leave, and it's just the tenants there, we're going to have a little talk, and we're going to make sure that you guys understand the severity of what we call social host in Mankato. It's a city ordinance, and that means that you as a tenant are providing a place for somebody or people under 21 to consume alcohol. That's our social host ordinance. So you will get cited for that on top of maybe your own underage ticket. So we will have a little kind of powwow in the living room talking about all of this. And you get what we call, we have a disturbance form that we fill out. That's our report on the loud party. It'll have every tenant on that, and then that'll go to our records in our city, and the city determines whether that's a strike on your property. Are you guys familiar with the strike process? Not many people are. So the strike process means if a apartment or house gets 3 strikes on it, that landlord, that management company cannot rent that place out for an entire year. So if I'm a landlord, I'm not going to allow 2 if 3 strikes on that property. So I would encourage all of you to read your individual leases and see what they say about the strike process and loud parties and getting busted by the cops, because there's also additional fines that they may impose on you if you do throw a party and gets busted, along with your ticket fine, along with city fines, so on and so forth. It's very expensive if your party gets busted. Antonia. Any questions with that? I know there's a lot of info. I got one right there.
She's got a good voice.
I was just curious, like, if I'm under 21 and I'm at a party, but I'm not drinking, is there any penalties for that if, like, cops show up?
No, if we can verify who you are and you have not been drinking, no, you have not committed any crime. Unless it's your house, I guess. If you're the one throwing the party, then yes, you could be imposed on those things. But if you wouldn't get an underage ticket, let's say.
I think there was another question over here.
I had the same question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
How does alcohol affect a person's ability to consent?
All right. So, as we talked about earlier, if you in any way think that something that happened when you were drinking, when you were under the influence of drugs or alcohol, that you didn't feel okay with, right? So I'm not speaking from a legal perspective, I'm speaking from an advocate's perspective, that you don't feel okay with, that you don't feel comfortable with, that you feel scared about, that you feel really as though there was a trauma that occurred, you can come talk to us, right? So again, there's no qualifiers for us in terms of whether or not there was alcohol involved. You might have experienced a sexual assault and there was not alcohol. Maybe you feel as though you were coerced into something. You didn't want to do something and you wound up feeling as though you had to. That is absolutely a reason that you can come and talk to us and utilize the resources that we have. But from a legal perspective, this is a different person to answer.
And I am also not providing a legal perspective. But I can say within our process, what we're actually looking for is whether the person who initiated the sexual activity obtained consent. So if that person was incapacitated in some way due to alcohol, the responsibility lies on that person who initiated the sexual activity. So we're not necessarily going to be looking at whether the person gave consent or not, is whether they had the ability to do that, and then what else happened in that situation, and whether that person may have had consent or not. And under our policy, which is our 1B3 sexual violence policy, we now as a Minnesota state system use the term affirmative consent. And again, that's more from the policy perspective on our campus.
From a legal perspective, and I want to be crystal clear about this, consent's defined in the statute, and consent first and foremost is not lack of objection. Okay, consent is the freely informed, or freely given informed consent about a particularized sex act given by somebody that has the capacity to consent. So in terms of alcohol, how does alcohol impairment impair whether or not there's consent or not? Well, if you're mentally incapacitated because of alcohol, you have to have the ability to give a reasoned consent. And there's a certain amount of alcohol consumption that obviously impacts an individual's ability to give reasoned consent. So every case is different. Every case is factually analyzed. But if you're in that situation, you've got to stop and ask yourself, what am I doing here? And am I having that dialogue in my head before this happens? Is this really the appropriate conduct to take? But every case is looked at a little bit differently. But alcohol certainly plays a part in it. And it's one of the considerations we obviously look at, because if you've consumed too much alcohol to have the mental capacity to even say yes, that's not consent. Consent cannot exist in that particular situation.
Excellent, thank you. I have a quick question along some of those lines. So what happens if I tell University Security or Residential Life CA that I have been sexually assaulted? What happens then?
Right, so there are some certain things that happen when, depending on where things start in the process. So if something that is told to a community advisor, they are required to report that. They are what's called a campus security authority, and so those things cannot be kept in confidence, and they have that additional responsibility. So usually it then starts with a process of them informing their supervisor, who then gets called, and then at that point security would be called. Per our process on our campus is that we're always calling a CADA, an advocate, to come out to campus. They're our 24/7 resource, and so oftentimes when things are happening, it's not when Laura's here 8 to 5 or 7 or however long she stays during the weekday. A lot of things are happening over the weekend and times when offices are closed. So CADA will come out and offer services. Student can choose to talk with them or not. It is offered as to whether or not they would like police to be called, and if not, police is not called. If they say yes, then security facilitates that, to call police to come to campus. Again, that would be very similar if it were to go directly to security. They would assess the situation and see what needs to happen at that point with the advocates and any other resources that need to be offered. After all of that, reports are created, and those will be forwarded to our office for any sort of review of whether or not anything needs to be investigated further and outreach and so on. But that's generally how that goes.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Okay, one more question for the panel before we wrap up here. So what can I do if I think my friend has a problem with alcohol?
Great question. There are two parts to answer this question. Let's first talk about the acute state. So if you're working with a friend or with a friend who you think is in some medical trouble, so let's review that. If your friend is vomiting, it's time to stop drinking, right? It's not to encourage them to drink anymore. It's not to suck it up, drink water, and then let's get back to boozing. That is your body saying you've had enough, to know your limits. You should know them prior to vomiting, right? I mean, many of you are novice alcohol users, and so you haven't quite had the experience to figure out enough's enough. But at the point of vomiting, that is time to stop drinking. You also need to intervene if your friend is intoxicated and you can't get their attention. If they're passed out and you can't wake them up, you need to call 911. That is a medical emergency. That is the last step of alcohol poisoning. So in those cases, I would just strongly encourage you. Again, I'm not telling you to not drink. I'm not anyone's parent in this room. You're all adults. You can make decisions about what chemicals go into your body. But I would hope that you would make good decisions about responsible use of these chemicals. And so, but again, if you get to vomiting, it's time to stop. And if your friend is passed out and you can't wake them up, it's time to call 911. If you think you have a friend who is chronically using alcohol and developing a problem, you can intervene. I mean, most of you in this room know someone in your life, whether it be a family member or a friend who is struggling with using a chemical like alcohol. Lots of people in this country struggle with alcoholism. And so engaging in a conversation, hey, I'm worried about you. and directing them to the various resources that we have. And on campus, you have lots of resources. I'll just give you one, the Counseling Center. If you are a student who thinks you're struggling with chemical use, whether it be alcohol or marijuana or prescription drugs, whatever it may be, you can go to the Counseling Center. It's an absolutely free resource that you have here on campus, and they will then connect you with the right place. So as a friend, be a friend. Help your friends know when's enough, and don't encourage this high-risk drinking because, again, I said alcohol can be used to have a good time, and lots of college students do that, and they have a good time. But there are cases, far too many cases, and even cases right here on this campus. It's not somewhere else, it's right here, where that good time quickly turns tragic. And we've had students die over the years on campus due to directly to alcohol consumption. And so let's not make 2019, 2020 another year for that statistic.
Panelists, anything to add? All right, wonderful. So as our time is drawing to a close here, I want to thank our panelists for providing some very helpful information. Also, a special thank you to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration for the stipend to host this town hall. Our panelists will be available. We have the room until about 4:30. So if you didn't get your specific question answered, or if you thought about something and you didn't want to raise your hand, you can certainly ask the panelists afterwards. Or we do have in the back by the resource table, we have the ability to submit your question in writing with your email address, and then someone will get back to you regarding that particular question. So again, on the behalf of our Healthy Mavericks Coalition, we want to thank you for attending, and thank you to our panelists from the Blue Earth County Attorney's Office, Mankato Public Safety, Committee Against Domestic Abuse, or CADA, Minnesota State Mankato Office of Equal Opportunity in Title IX, Minnesota State Mankato Violence Awareness Response Program, and Minnesota State Mankato Alcohol and Drug Studies Program. So thank you again for attending.